There is a specific kind of disorientation that belongs almost exclusively to one generation. You remember a time before the internet was everywhere. Not ancient history, just childhood. You remember being unreachable. You remember looking things up in books because there was no other option. You remember boredom that had no exit, no screen to fill it, just time that had to be sat through until something happened. And then, somewhere in your adolescence or early adulthood, everything changed. Not slowly. Suddenly, the technology arrived, you adopted it. And within a few years, the world you had grown up in was so thoroughly replaced that it started to feel like it had never quite existed. Like a set that got dismantled between scenes. And now you live in the digital world as fluently as anyone. You cannot imagine navigating without it. But something in you remembers the other version, carries it, notices its absence in ways that people who grew up entirely in the connected world simply do not. That is not nostalgia. It is something more structural than that. And it has shaped this generation in ways that are still being understood. Psychologists and researchers use the term Millennials to describe the microgeneration sitting at the precise intersection. Born roughly between the late 1970s and early 1990s, old enough to have had an analog childhood, young enough to have adopted digital life before it became optional. But the experience extends broadly across millennials in different degrees depending on exactly when they were born and where they grew up. What defines this generation psychologically is not a list of preferences or complaints. It is the experience of having genuinely internalized two different operating systems for how the world works. The analog world ran on delayed information. You did not know what was happening somewhere else until someone told you, or until the news came on. Social comparison happened locally, with the people you could actually see, whose lives you had genuine context for. Mistakes were witnessed by a limited audience and faded with time because nothing was recorded. Identity was something you built gradually, mostly in private, and revised without documentation. The digital world runs on entirely different logic. Information is immediate and everywhere. Social comparison is global, continuous, and stripped of context. Mistakes can be permanent. Identity is performed, documented, and subject to public evaluation in real time. Moving between those two operating systems in the middle of development, not as a choice, but as a fact of when you happened to be born, did something specific to this generation's psychology. The clinical term for holding two contradictory frameworks simultaneously is cognitive dissonance. But what happened to millennials is not quite dissonance in the traditional sense, because the two frameworks do not feel contradictory from the inside. They feel like different modes that activate in different contexts. There's the part of this generation that genuinely values presence, slowness, depth of connection, values absorbed from an analog childhood where those things were simply how life worked. And there's the part that is completely at home in the pace and logic of digital life, that finds a connectivity genuinely useful and often genuinely meaningful. The tension is not between those two parts. It is in the exhaustion of continuously navigating between them, of knowing what slower felt like and living in something faster, of understanding concentration from a time when it was not constantly competed for, while living in an environment specifically engineered to fragment it. This generation also came of age during a period of extraordinary economic disruption. They were told, with genuine conviction, that education was the path, that following the expected sequence, school, degree, career, stability, would produce the life that sequence had produced for the generation before them. Many of them followed that sequence faithfully, and arrived at the other end to find that the contract had changed while they were completing their side of it. The debt was real. The stability was not. The careers that were supposed to materialize either did not or looked nothing like what had been described. Psychologists studying this generation consistently find elevated rates of anxiety, financial stress, and a specific kind of disillusionment that is different from ordinary disappointment. It is the disillusionment of someone who followed the instructions correctly and found the instructions were written for a world that no longer existed by the time they finished following them. That experience of doing what you were told to do and having it not work does something to a person's relationship with institutions, with authority, with the idea that the established path is worth trusting. It produces a skepticism that looks like cynicism from the outside, but is actually something more specific. It is the reasonable conclusion of someone who ran the experiment and observed the results. There is something else this generation carries that is rarely named directly. They are the first generation to have been parented under the influence of a significant cultural shift in how childhood was understood. The rise of helicopter parenting, of structured activities replacing unstructured time, of the idea that children needed to be continuously supervised, stimulated, and protected from the natural friction of an unmanaged world. The research on what that produced is complicated. There is genuine evidence that this generation has stronger emotional vocabulary, more awareness of mental health, more willingness to seek help than generations before them. These are real gains. There is also evidence of a reduced tolerance for uncertainty, a higher baseline anxiety, and a specific difficulty with a kind of unstructured, self-directed problem solving that comes from having been left alone as a child with a problem and no adult to resolve it. Not because this generation is weak, because that particular developmental experience of figuring something out without help, of sitting in a difficulty without rescue, was structured out of many of their childhoods with the best of intentions. What makes this generation genuinely different, not better or worse different, is the specific combination of things they hold simultaneously. A memory of slowness and a life lived at speed. A deep familiarity with connection and a well-documented loneliness. High emotional intelligence and high anxiety. Idealism that was genuinely formed and pragmatism that was learned the hard way when the idealism met reality. They grew up being told they were special and enter a world that was largely indifferent to that. They were handed optimism as a framework and then had to build something more complicated and more durable out of the materials that actually showed up. And what tends to emerge from that specific combination of experiences is not what the cultural conversation about millennials usually describes. Not entitlement, not fragility, not the caricature that became so familiar it started to feel like a fact. What actually tends to emerge is adaptability, the specific kind that comes from having had to update your operating system more than once. From having held one model of the world and watched it change and build a new one without losing what was worth keeping from the first. That is not a small thing. It is, quietly, exactly what the current moment requires.